Hello, everyone, again. My name is Nicolas Lima. I'm currently the police chief of the Vila dos Cabanos police station in the city of Barcarena, in interior the state of Pará, in northern region of Brazil. I will present my ideas based on my police experience, but for obvious reasons, I cannot reveal details of case, and I also believe that this is not the intention of the seminar. Uh, the issue of violence against children and adolescents in Brazil is much discussed topic, has different meanings depending on the region of the country, because Brazil is a country of continental dimensions, and the north region, where the Amazon rainforest is located, suddenly has the lowest rates of women and education development. This leads to several social and criminal problems. One of each is child abuse. Unfortunately, the north and northwest region of Brazil are traditionally less populated and have poor infrastructure, sorry, have high rates of sexual crime against children. Most of the time within in the family itself, sometimes in place so fair way that the parents themselves sell the sexual dignity of their children in exchange for food or fuel. These are unbelievable situations. Uh, but Brazilian legislation is extremely severe with those who commit crimes against children and adolescents, teenagers, especially in cases of sexual crimes. There are several laws that protect children, but unfortunately, what see most in police station is the law begin apply after the abuse has already been committed. Despite existing provision mechanisms, several mechanisms, in fact, they have little activists. Obviously, the police act when the crime has already occurred, but how to implement mechanisms to prevent the abuse occurring? Uh, Today, the subject is already deaf with the classroom from on early age, but I believe that future evolution is necessary. There is already an integration between the public criminal representation ages. In Brazil is Ministério Público, police, law system in general, and educational sector. Lectures, seminars, and awareness movements are often held. But violence and its consequences are violation of human rights and are also considered a serious public health problem in the world. According to the 2002 WHO report, the case of violence suffered in childhood occur in most vulnerable stage of life, because they are mostly committed within the family environment. They are covered up the silence of the victims and can be perpetuates of months and years. In Brazil, children are protected by several legal and institutional norms that guarantee at least as fair a law in concern their fundamental human rights. Uh, One this norm is the Children and Adolescent Statute. In Portuguese, know the ACA, ECA. Uh, uh, in Article 5 of that states that no child or adolescent shall be subject to any form of neglect, discrimination, exploration, violence, cruelty or oppression, and any violation by action or omission on their fundamental rights shall be punished by law. Um, every day, we must act to combat the abuse and sexual exploitation of children, of course. However, May 19 is a special date to dedicate to this subject in Brazil, because in this date, uh, in the year 1973, one children, it is named Arielle. She was raped and sexual violence. However, despite the the entire month of May marked by this fight with the Orange May campaign. I made the raising awareness of the role of society and several sectors through various actions in Brazil. In my 4 years of police chief, I have unfortunately had to act in cases of sexual crimes against children, and I often have left a mark on me in some way. It's the coldness of the older criminal who showed he didn't care about the harm he had done to the victim, or even the innocence of the 5 years old child abuse by his own cousin, smiling when he saw him in the police station. But the biggest worry I have as a policeman is to know that they managed to intervene in only a few cases. Signs this usually occur in family or domestic environments, such place where the victim should be protected. The black figures of criminality, numbers of crimes committed and not reported to the police, in this case, regretfully is immense. Uh, on the other hand, the police are often sought out by victims who were abused in childhood and who nowadays as adults decide to report what happened and demand stage action. In this regard, Brazil legislation took a great leap in 2012, provided um, something imprescriptibility, imprescriptibility of sexual crimes against children during childrenhood. In other words, the statute of limitations only begin to run the victims come of age, which in Brazil is 18 years old. But of course, this change has a reason, and it's not a noble reason. 14 years ago, the swimmer and Pan American Game medalist Joana Maranhão, who was 20 years old at the time, revealed that she was sexually abused by former coach when she was 9 years old. The case brought much outrage and caused the legislation to be changed. And that's where the problem with this type crime lies. The change are almost always paradigmatic. They only occur because a barbaric and atrocious crime and happen, and I believe that is where we must improve. Try to anticipate this case. Instructing children from early age about of rules of their bodies, what can I cannot be done. Otherwise, we will continue to arrive late and let the innocence of children all over the world be lost. Well, I think the work developed by the child chapter and the other speakers, because it's the work that you make. It's so that one day child abuse will not commonplace. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, good morning, whatever time of the day it is in all of the different parts of the world. Nicholas, listening to that, it's absolutely heartbreaking, and obviously being you're at the forefront in the police, seeing the victims and the criminals themselves. It must be just horrendous, but well done to the work you are doing, though. You know, it must be so tough. You just want to absolutely tear those people apart for what they do, you know, but yes. Anyways, to Jakir, Sonu and your team, as global child activists of Child Chapter and an incredible worthy cause, you are an inspiration. Thank you so much for the kind invitation to be part of Child Chapter. I was absolutely honoured to be asked, but also deeply saddened when I was putting my presentation together. You know, it's really highlighted a lot of things that I'm not always thinking about. So I thank you for letting me be a part of this today. So I highly commend any organisation for highlighting any form of child abuse. It just breaks my heart to see any child subject to any kind of form of neglect. I've travelled all over the world, fortunately, you know, for business, for pleasure. And I've seen the poverty of children on the streets, malnourished, unclean and unhappy. In India, Egypt, and even when I was in Beirut in Lebanon with a friend a couple of years ago, I just remember seeing two young boys, they were about 10 and 11. They were sat on some stairs, they were brothers, and the younger boy was just sobbing. So we stopped, we were actually jogging, we were running at the time, so we didn't have money on us, I just had my phone on me. So we stopped and we offered to buy them, you know, some food. And there was a McDonald's, as there is always. And they were like, we'd love to have some McDonald's. So I had my phone, I was able to pay with my phone because we didn't have cash on us. But even when we got to McDonald's, to the door, they were refused entrance because of the way they're dirty, you know, they don't trust them, these poor little children. So we brought the food out to them. But all I wanted to do, and my friend, is just to give them a hug. Because they look so lonely, they're lonely and they're sad on their own, deserted on the streets. So we arranged to meet them the next day so we could buy them some clothes and give them some cash, but they didn't turn up and we didn't see them again. But it's really stuck very deeply in my heart, and knowing around the world the poverty children experience. So the programs Child Chapter offer include in providing the food, healthcare, education and child abuse awareness to underprivileged children, working towards building happy childhoods. Is an incredible initiative. And I hope by being part of this, all of us, you are inviting, that we can raise that awareness, funds and support to this worthy organisation. But thank you once again, to Child Chapter and to all of the other contributors together. Together we are stronger, together we can make a difference. So Sonu, now I have a presentation. Can you share my screen, please?
Yeah, you can share. Yeah, please go ahead.
Can I just do that? Okay. I'm not very techy.
You able to share? You click on share screen.
Yes.
Yeah, we can see. Yeah.
You can see. Okay. So yeah, no, I've just put this together, doing a bit of research, but from some of the knowledge I know, but what I want to learn more about anyway. So as you introduced me earlier, I am Sandy Donnelly and founder of Women Warriors Network, which is a global platform for female empowerment, and also the owner of DBC Health Retreats, which is just providing healthy services to people, trying to keep them fit and healthy. So there are over 1 billion children who experience some form of abuse over the course of a year. And I mean, again, I'm shocked to hear this. This is a huge percentage of the population who are being abused in some way or other. And a lot of it seems to stem from poverty, people living in deprived areas. And it is something we want to try to help prevent or, help so it's reduced at least. And if we can help any children at any time, I think, it would be, we'd feel good about being able to help this cause. So anyway, violence against children, which includes all forms of violence against people under 18 years old, whether perpetrated by their parents, which is horrendous, or other caregivers, peers, romantic partners, or strangers. I mean, this is really sad to hear. A lot of it is coming close to home. It's not the person on the street who nobody knows. It usually is by somebody they know. I find this just shocking and just absolutely heartbreaking. Globally, it is estimated that up to 1 billion children aged 2 to 17 years have experienced the physical, sexual, or emotional violence or neglect in the past year. I mean, I thought these statistics were over a long period of time. So for me, it's shocking results to hear that this is only in the past year. And I know with COVID, people in lockdown, a lot of children haven't had those resources or means to be able to reach out in school or other places. And I think, as we know, the statistics rose throughout this time for a lot of people in abusive relationships and for children themselves. So again, it's got to be stopped. Experiencing violence in childhood impacts lifelong health and well-being. And I think we know this is quite fact because you often see it, and not always the case, but a lot of children who've been abused can end up abusing or in situations, crime, etc. But evidence from around the world shows that violence against children can be prevented. And I think this is what we're all here for today anyway, is to try and see what we can do. So I'm zooming in because my eyesight isn't the best nowadays to see what's going on. So this was also, it wasn't too shocking to read, but it's when you see it on paper and you listen and it's highlighted that it shocks you even more. So result in death, homicide, which often involves weapons such as knives, firearms, is among the top 4 causes of death in adolescence, with boys comprising over 80% of victims and perpetrators. So again, the impact of what they've been through, it then folds over to other cases, which again, it has to be stopped so we can just try and help these young people. Again, the impact leads to severe injuries. For every homicide, there are hundreds of predominantly male victims of youth violence who sustain injuries because of physical fighting and assault. And we know there's a lot of them because they're so angry within themselves. They're getting themselves into so much trouble because they're angry. It's a bit of a cry for help, but then it's that spiral of causing more issues and a bigger picture. This also was interesting, but also I totally understood it. Impairing the brain and nervous system development. So exposure to violence at an early age can impair brain development and damage other parts of the nervous system, as well as the endocrine, circulatory, musculoskeletal, reproductive, respiratory, and immune systems with lifelong consequences. As such, violence against children can negatively affect cognitive development and result in educational and vocational underachievement. So again, it's not just, it's their physical health as well as their mental health, which is being affected because the damage which has been done to these poor young people, you know. Also resulting in negative coping and health risk behaviours. Children exposed to violence and other adversities are substantially more likely to smoke, misuse alcohol and drugs, and engage in high-risk sexual behaviour. They also have higher rates of anxiety, depression, and other mental health problems, and unfortunately, suicide. And I think even with suicide, we know that's on the increase with young people, you know, in the UK, globally it is. And often, not always, but often it stems from abuse as a child. So it's just awfully, terribly sad. Also carrying on with the impact of violence, leading to unintended pregnancies. We know that this is a very big issue. And again, I think in poverty deprived areas where there's not contraception isn't available for them, they don't understand if they're being abused at a young age, the consequences of then being pregnant, which again leads to lots of other issues. Induced abortions, gynecological problems, and sexually transmitted infections, including HIV. Now, I know with HIV, it's something at Child Chapter you look into a lot, and it's something I'd like to learn more about, because here in the UK, particularly, we don't hear so much. It's obviously not such an issue. But obviously, globally, we know that it is still a big issue. It's still out there and it still needs to be sorted out. Contribute to a wide range of non-communicable diseases. As children grow older, the increased risk for cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, and other health conditions is largely due to the negative coping and health risk behaviours associated with violence. And again, I think this is something we know of, that, you know, people with some kinds of diseases, cancers, with that more negative approach, mental approach, because mentally they're not capable of looking at the right, okay, it may be okay, we can fight through this, we can get through this. It's just bringing them down that bit more and just not helping them even with these diseases. So again, it's that other, there's issue after issue, you know, from one case of abuse, whether it be lack of education, sexual abuse, any of these things which affect the child mentally. You've then got these further issues which are out of their control, which is awful. And then obviously impact opportunities in future generations. Children exposed to violence and other adversities are more likely to drop out of school, if they're lucky to even get to school, to have an education even. They have difficulty finding and keeping a job and are at heightened risk for later victimization and or perpetration of interpersonal and self-directed violence, by which violence against children can affect the next generation. So again, it's terribly sad to hear when you really look into it, and this is why I'm really honored and feel privileged to be a part of this, because it's opening my eyes, it's making me aware, and it makes me want to speak out, because I feel I have 2 daughters and a grandchild. And, you know, the thought of any harm coming to, you know, your own family, let alone any child. It doesn't even bear thinking about. So prevention, violence against children can be prevented, as we know, if there's the resources out there. Preventing and responding to violence against children requires that efforts systematically address risk and protective factors at all four interrelated levels: individual, relationship, community, and society. And then just finally, the 7 strategies. And I think, you know, we're kind of aware, like semi-aware of some of these, but again, they probably just need highlighting and then reinforcing so that we can help this prevention by being part of Child Chapter, you know, that hopefully we can work together. So the implementation and enforcement of laws banning violent discipline and restricting access to alcohol and firearms. I mean, in the UK, we don't, thank God, we don't currently have an issue with firearms, but knife crime has been on the increase over the years, and it's usually through teenage boys, and there's a lot of teenage boys losing their lives unnecessarily. But you look at the families or where they, you know, the background of a lot of them, and these issues are becoming more of a bigger problem in the UK. Norms and values change, for example, altering norms that condone the sexual abuse of girls or aggressive behavior among boys. So obviously we know this has to be changed. Safe environments, identifying neighborhoods, hotspots for violence, and then addressing the local causes through problem-oriented policing and other interventions. So, you know, what they try to do here in the UK is in the more poverty areas, they set up community centres and places for youths to be able to go and, you know, do some kinds of activities. And you can always notice it's children who are from a more of a privileged upbringing. You know, the parents can afford to give them piano lessons and pay for tennis lessons, all of these nice activities. But obviously, you know, even us being brought up when we were younger, I'm one of 6 children and a single parent. My mum was a single parent, and we couldn't afford to do anything. But my mum was very strict. She wouldn't let us go out of the garden gate till we were, I don't know what. So she tried to kind of keep us close to her as long as she could, so we wouldn't get into any trouble. But we didn't have the activities. But then there's a lot of children. There's a lot of schools now, they're trying to give, you know, they've got these funds, these additional funds to try and keep children after school. So they've got additional activities so that they're not roaming the streets, you know, wandering around. Also, parental and caregiver support, providing parent training to young and first-time parents. Because if parents have been in an abusive relationship or had some kind of abuse previously, you know, when they were younger, they need to try and identify and see. They might think it's okay to leave a child or some kind of neglect, which obviously wouldn't be acceptable for any of us. We'd be horrified. Income and economic strengthening, such as microfinance and gender equity training. So again, this is something, you know, with funding, it's another big issue, and this is a global issue. If people haven't got that funding, it's something we need to be, I think together we can do this together, that we can, if we can raise funds, raise awareness, we can make that difference. And then just response services provision, for example, ensuring that children who are exposed to violence can access effective emergency care and receive appropriate physio-social support. I think in schools, they did give a lot of education now here, I know in the UK, but obviously in deprived areas where children don't have the luxury of an education or going to a school, how will they ever know, oh, this is wrong, this shouldn't be happening to me, this isn't nice. they've got no outlet, you know, and again, something I hope we can work together to help change. And then finally, education, of course, and life skills, such as ensuring that children attend school if they're lucky enough, and provide life and social skills training. I mean, that concludes my my presentation here. But again, it's, for me, putting this presentation together when I was invited, it's really like perked me up and made me think, you know, it's easy for us to go about our everyday lives and worry about the small things in our lives, you know, COVID, I lost my business, it's all these little things. I have my home, I have my health, I have my family. I know I'm very, very fortunate. So it also makes me realize that if there is some way I can help, I'm really grateful to be part of this. So thank you very much for having me. And as I said to the other speakers, to Child Chapter, and I think, you know, together, you know, you're building these global connections, and this is exactly the way we can try to do it. We're stronger together. Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you so much for the opportunity to participate. When I received the invitation, the timing could not have been better, because many of the topics that Child Chapter is focused on are directly tied to the work that I'm engaged in right now in Uganda. So it was very exciting, because this is something that I wake up in the morning, I have no running water, so my hair is so awesome. You get to do the bird bath sort of scenario. There's no electricity when the sun goes down. I live in a village in Bocadea right now with local families, children, primarily focused on how we help reduce the cycle of poverty. And what I'm going to talk about a little today is the findings that I have from volunteering in these rural communities. I'm grateful that the #1 gift in my life, my 10-year-old son, is as passionate about this as I am. So we've been spending a lot of time focusing on how do we build these values and these systems and structures that engage the voice of not only people like us who look at it as adults, but how do we translate that to what a child needs to hear to make the world more open, and I would say to normalize the conversation around abuse. I always start when I'm working with individuals who are not as familiar with this, with some of the statistics that are absolutely staggering to me, and that is that nearly 3 in 4 children under the age of 4 regularly suffer physical punishment and or psychological violence at the hands of parents and caregivers. This stuns me, honestly. I grew up in an era where there was no spanking any longer. There was no acceptance of putting your hands on a child. And the fact that that isn't globally recognized is stunning. And that children as young as 2, who are, this is from a World Health Organization output from June of 2021, are routinely subjected. It's not a one-time incident, it's consistent. And they have no ability to raise their hand and say, this is happening to me. And that is startling and stunning. And that is a global trend that I would say is part of what's driving this to endemic crisis level. Is we have our greatest gifts that have no voice yet, that are already being damaged and are going to potentially suffer for the rest of their life for something they can't speak about. The other statistic that I think is really meaningful when it comes to the concept of normalizing this is 1 in 5 women and 1 in 13 men report that they've been sexually abused. I guarantee this is underreported because of the stigma associated with raising your hand and saying, me too. I come to you today as someone who identifies as a survivor. I was sexually abused as a teenager by a stranger, and it wasn't until I could talk about that comfortably, and it wasn't until I engaged in peer mentorship with others who were struggling and owning that message and normalizing this happens and it's not your fault, that I made the jump from victim to survivor. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think needs to be done for more people to feel comfortable doing that. First 30 years of my life, I can honestly say, absolute victim in silence, absolute victim in secret, because I had not processed what impact that pain had on my survival and my life. And the greatest gift that I try to bring right now, and part of the reason I am in Uganda working largely with young mothers, yesterday I had the opportunity to work at the health clinic with Thursdays are HIV day. So everyone there is pregnant or a recent mom, and they're all HIV positive. And the opportunity to sit down and learn from them. We're doing a regression statistical analysis of pre-COVID, post-COVID spike in teenage pregnancies. It's dramatic, particularly in Africa. And we've been able to partner with the district health ministry to collect that data. And right now I'm at the anecdotal phase of meeting with these moms and meeting with these pregnant girls to understand, different factors, socioeconomic status, health and safety, views of the future. And I would lie if I said I didn't cry after our session yesterday. I met with two girls. One was 9 and one was 10, both HIV positive, both pregnant. I mean, the likelihood that they survive giving birth, much less the trauma that they've gone through that they can barely articulate, is impossible for me to grasp, even as someone who has gone through the pain of these sorts of encounters. But that is the reason why I do the work that I do in this capacity. A lot of my time has been spent in corporate America, but the healing comes from giving back in places like this and being present and creating a voice for those that have none. So I share that just as I kind of jump into my thinking, learnings, and just to make it real for me. Getting into the community is the number one way to do that. And it's not staying at a hotel at a distance. It's being present and playing soccer at night with the kids and gaining that trust. And that's another key point that I'll talk about here shortly that I think is critical. It's having community leaders, whether they reflect the community they are a part of, or whether they're intentionally present to listen and build support. Having community role models is what is sorely lacking when it comes to giving children a voice. So if I think about what do we know is working? Because Sandy, you hit on this. You really did a great job succinctly going through global driving factors of this problem. I focus a lot on the concept of commission versus omission. And this in the United States is a big deal because maltreatment of children, it represents 75% or more of the abuse cases that go through our system. And the 25%, which is the sexual abuse, the physical abuse, that's what gets a lot of the attention. But the opportunity to focus on that other 75% that don't have a meal at night, that don't have an understanding from the parental perspective of what behavior is acceptable, that are still going through corporal style punishment when they misbehave, that's an area that doesn't get as much attention that I think we really need to start addressing systemically. Some of it is cultural. Some of it is socioeconomic and education based, but there's not a good understanding at a global level of what constitutes abuse. And that's where I come back to this concept of normalizing and standardizing this discussion and making it something that's okay to talk about. Child Chapter is doing a fantastic job of doing just that, of creating this forum. I could not be more excited. I get super passionate about these things, and to listen to Sandy and I listened to some of your other interviews to realize there is this global community. I find my tribe here in this, and when you come to these places, you find the ones that are like you and care, but to start creating that global dialogue where we all have that same voice, that same mission. There's a soccer match on here, so I apologize if you can hear them chiming. I got as far away from the noise as possible. But you're doing the work that needs to be done. So much of this happens in isolation. I've started networking specifically for needs within Africa during COVID, because there are so many isolated entities that are focused on helping children and focused on helping young mothers. We need to pool our resources and our voices. It's the only way that we can be effective. If we continue to operate in silos and small NGOs here and there competing for minimalist grants, we're not going to move the needle. And what I love about Child Chapter's focus and why I'm excited to be a part of this is you're doing just that. You're bringing people from all over the world together to standardize and normalize this discussion. So thank you. What do we know has worked? And Sandy did hit on a few of these topics, but I'm just going to run through those quickly and then talk about what I think are approaches that are maybe different than what we've measured in the past. I'm in the process of writing a white paper about several of them. So again, the timing was perfect to have this conversation. But we know that if we support parents and caregivers in understanding the symptoms and the causes of abuse, assuming they are not the one that is engaging in it. Sandy touched on this, but the majority of the time, the person who is delivering the abuse knows the child. My instance is rare that it was a complete stranger. I don't fit the mold, right? I come from a first world country. My father is a doctorally prepared psychologist. My mother is a school teacher. Like, I did not fit the risk profile. And those are the cases that tend to get attention, whereas the day-to-day occurrences of people who don't look like me don't get that same attention, don't get that same ability to have resources that support them transition from victim to survivor. So I think it's critical that we have, and data suggests this works, that we are actively engaging parents and caregivers. And if they are the ones that are delivering the abuse, there are a number of studies that suggest that putting them in a mentorship program with others who've gone through the similar system and been successful is an effective strategy. So, and that comes back to that commission versus omission. Sometimes people don't even know what they're doing constitutes abuse, and they need someone that can level with them, not judge them, get to the point of helping them through the process to see those next steps. The other piece that we know works, and I'm going through the obvious ones quickly because Sandy did a great job summarizing these, but education and life skill training. We look at young mothers. This is something I'm focused on here in Uganda. How do you prepare a 10-year-old? My son is 10, and I'm just like, oh my goodness, if I were trying to teach you how to parent, you still play Pokemon? I don't think so. But it's interesting to me to put yourself at that level when you understand developmental milestones. I was teaching a group of young girls math yesterday. School has been out for two years at this point. We were able to raise enough funds to donate a very large printer and copier and create community tents that the children are coming to so that we can try to assess where they're at in terms of academic preparedness. I was sitting with a group of children, two of whom are pregnant and very young, and asking them motivational questions to understand their views of the future. Not a single person in that circle could tell me they had any view for themselves other than becoming a mother and a wife. That's horrifying. And that is a self-fulfilling prophecy that continues to lead to this cycle of abuse because they assume that's all I'm going to be. One of them is 12 and that's what she's going to be. So she's achieved it early in her mind. She sees nothing wrong with her circumstance. And that is another opportunity from education and life skills interventions to start saying, do you know what an astronaut is? You know how cool it would be if you went to Mars and found water? That'd be awesome. Let's talk about that. Start having those conversations and opening the eyes of young girls and boys to what else is out there when their worldview is so limited that all they can see is what has come before them. There are a number of programs that do this really well. Most of my work is in Africa, so I see that there's an organization called Kakenya's Dream. Kakenya is phenomenal. She has the TED Talks, if you're not familiar with her. She was a victim of genital mutilation in Kenya when she was a young girl and demanded that she had to go to school. And she wanted to continue to go to school. And as she excelled and went to college, she moved to the United States to generate funds and now runs one of the most successful schools in Africa to help young girls get out of that cycle of abuse. There are programs that do this really well. So the other thing I think is important is taking a best practice approach to understanding how do we break this cycle. And a lot of times it means that we're removing children from their environments altogether. And that's what she has done. She has identified risk factors within her community and worked to move the needle in terms of just removing the children and giving them the life skills, the socioeconomic support, and the vision of a future. It's amazing what you can do when you see opportunity and you see yourself in a light of potential. And so those are a couple of ideas that I know work, that if we were to standardize those things, create a global dialogue, create more significant funding to help these NGOs and schools get off the ground, that would make a huge difference, particularly in the developing nations that don't have schools at all. You would be stunned. I don't know if you've had the opportunity to visit rural Africa at all. Sanu, I have been to India and been to Bangalore, and you struggle with a lot of the same challenges there. It's lack of access, it's lack of awareness. It is having to work at a very young age to support your family were things that I observed when I was visiting there. And very much the rural village life is the same. And so I think the more that we also say, our problems are unique but not abnormal, is something that also helps that dialogue as we bring together community leaders across the world. So when I think of those things, those are pretty standard, right? We know that we can do positive, but all of those things I talked about require money, they require resources, they require leaders like Child Chapter that have the ability to actually launch formalized programs. And a lot of times that's not feasible in these economies where, $3 is more than people make in a week. It's not feasible. And there's not sufficient funding or global attention to grow at the speed that the problem is growing. And that's one of the things that we're looking at right now as well with the analysis around the teenage girls who are now pregnant, is what we're going to experience from that if we don't intervene is a massive population boom of underskilled, undereducated women. And if we aren't pulling women up and we aren't getting them into the economy as workers, as thinkers, we're going to continue to see the delta deviate in terms of how these developing nations are performing. There's no question in my mind or heart about that. And I talked to a lot of leaders in the continent about their observations, and it is a call to action, and it is getting increasingly worse with COVID, as Sandy touched on, the isolation factor, the lack of role models that were barely present to begin with. Teachers are the number one cited motivator, caretaker reason that a lot of these children who are abused, neglected, or pregnant, or ill with HIV, who do they look up to? And it's their teacher, because it's the only person they see in a position of authority that believes in them. And now that that's gone away, so has their hope. And I have observed that firsthand here for more tears than I care to admit. But it is really something that we should take as an opportunity, as opposed to a fly in, fly out sort of approach. And that's what we're trying to do here. I touched on this in the beginning, but normalizing the definition, dialogue, and acceptance of talking about abuse is the number one thing that I think changes how abuse and how survivors, victims that hopefully make that jump to survivor, are able to heal. And again, it's a process. And I can't imagine if I didn't have my family and a strong social network and access to resources, who knows, I'd probably be in prison right now. But I'm grateful that I had all of those people that helped me turn the corner. And I think about all of these young women I'm meeting with, and boys as well. We've had a few boys that have come forward, and as again, they become more comfortable seeing us in their community, seeing us at the soccer pitch at night, football pitch. I have to stop calling it soccer. They look at me like I'm an alien when I say that. But when we see them out, and we're a part of what they're doing, and we shop at the same place and we go to the same markets, they start feeling more comfortable. And there's this absolute curiosity, because there are no white people here whatsoever. So there's also this interest to start the conversation with, like, who are you? What are you doing? And you can kind of soften that discussion. And that's the approach we've taken to just being approachable and being someone that is a safe role model to talk about what are you going through. We go to the hospital every morning and the school and most afternoons, and alternate in the district with those two outlets, and their mothers see us, their fathers see us, and it becomes just a kind of a safe conversation starter. So the more that we can come together to make raising your hand and saying this isn't right something that is socially acceptable to do and doesn't create stigma or fear, that's what I think is step one. It was shocking to me recently when we were teaching a class at one of the other district locations. Two young girls are obviously pregnant in the class, and this is not a designated
there are typically designated places that they go, because after they give birth, the likelihood that they return to education is pretty much nothing. And we are working on getting them into their own programs so that we can teach vocational trades in the hope, and entrepreneurial skills and budgeting, in the hope that they take that information and the supplies that have been donated, and as we teach them to sew and teach them to create soap and candles, that they can then have a sustainable way of earning money. But that's not common. So we've been trying to move the pregnant young girls into their own sorts of coursework where we can interweave the vocational trade. But I asked the instructor when I noticed these two very obviously pregnant girls, do you have pregnant girls in your class? And she looked at me square in the face and said, no. So, okay. So I think part of that also is, we have a duty to report in the United States, and I believe you do as well, Sandy, in the UK, where if you see something, say something, and you're in a position of authority as a teacher or a police officer, that doesn't exist here. So I think part of normalizing the conversation is making a global duty to report something that is celebrated and doesn't create stigma and isn't viewed as breaking up families really hard culturally in these rural areas, because this is such a systemic issue. Giving birth at young ages is what is normalized, not the opposite. And so changing that to be the exception versus the rule is a key part of this. I also think that there should be an outcomes-based approach to reporting on these instances of abuse. The World Health Organization does a good job in aggregate averages, but you'll notice that most things on there are round numbers, and we know there aren't 300 million anything like that's not consistent, or they're not 3/4 of the population. So those are estimates. Those are informed guesses. I would love to see in the area of child abuse, neglect, and also lack of access to healthcare and education, that there's a report card that has to be delivered by these communities and these countries, and they're held to the same standards as we would things like earnings or GDP. And that this is an annual report that looks at the status of children globally and starts to hold countries accountable that aren't advocating for their most precious resource, which is their children. That is the next step that I think is critical to pulling this conversation to the global stage, is to say, we're going to start creating an environment that compares these countries, and there will be punitive and non-punitive actions for how they're performing. I think the other piece, and this is my kind of last one, and then I'll turn it back over to you, but one of the things that in the trauma process is proven to have positive outcomes is the concept of forgiveness, and teaching children to forgive themselves first and to have that grace and that safe space is not a part of standardized trauma management for children anywhere that I'm aware of. It comes up in psychiatry and psychology to some extent, but standardizing the concept of forgiveness for victims of abuse from a young age, of forgiving themselves. One of the number one reasons I've found talking to people that they don't share their experiences until they know you've had one is they're worried about what you'll think. And they're worried, they themselves believe it's their fault. I know that was my reaction when I went through my experience was, ooh, just be quiet because you're going to be judged. You're viewed as damaged. It's your fault. And making children comfortable forgiving themselves first, everything else comes later, is a proven tactic in any sort of trauma counseling to help young individuals, or any individual that's overcoming that, take that leap to survivor from victim. And that's just, it ties back to that concept of normalizing the dialogue. So these are things I'm very passionate about. Largely within the continent of Africa is where I focus right now because the needs are so great. But anything that I can do to advance this dialogue, and it's wonderful to meet you, Sandy, to meet other people who have ideas and are experiencing the same sorts of opportunities for impact, is why I'm excited to work with Child Chapter and honored to be a part of this conversation today. So thank you.